The original Alone in the Dark was considered a pioneer in terms of fear factor as well as gameplay, and is known to be the godfather of 3D survival horror games. Taking inspiration from the likes of H.P. Lovecraft, Alone in the Dark was praised for its eccentric design and pacing compared to other titles released for its time. However, the two sequels that followed didn't supersede the original due to being outdated by its competition, as you had games like Resident Evil, which was under the influence of Shinji Mikami, and Konami's Silent Hill. In order to compete with their rivals, Inforgrams handed the series to Darkworks, who also worked on 1906 Antarctic Odyssey, and would later develop games like Cold Fear, Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter, and I Am Alive. In 2001, they released Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare for multiple platforms, and was praised by multiple gaming outlets. However, just because it got positive reception, it doesn't mean it's guaranteed to age well in the long term. Therefore, did Darkworks succeed with their IP, or has Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare plunged into darkness? The story opens up with a report that Charles Fisk, a friend and partner to main protagonist Edward Carnby, has been found dead off the coast of Shadow Island. With this shocking news, Carnby sets off to the island to investigate how his partner died, as well as recover 3 ancient tablets that contain extraordinary power. He's also accompanied with Aline Sidrak, a young professor, to assist with the mission, but she's also involved for her own motives. However, when the plane gets attacked by an unknown entity, they are forced to parachute but are separated from one another, and it's up to them to figure out what's going on. Like the early Resident Evil games, Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare allows you to play from one or two perspectives, either Carnby or Aline. Both characters play slightly differently to one another. As Carnby, his gameplay leads towards combat. You'll start off with a revolver, but eventually you'll gain access to more powerful weapons like a triple-barreled shotgun, rocket launcher, grenade launcher, etc. Aline's campaign is geared towards solving puzzles, but that's not to say she's completely defenseless. Her flashlight is not only used to light her path, it can also scare off certain monsters that lurk in the darkness, as well as illuminate items of interest in the environment. Carnby is also equipped with the flashlight. However, regardless of which character you choose, their paths will intersect with one another either to give exposition or give specific items for future use. The controls are also similar to Resident Evil with its tank-like movement, which emphasises the survival horror aspect, and of course the game has fixed camera angles so you can't see what's lurking around the next corner. This means keeping your firearms topped up before engagements is crucial in order to prolong your survival. While reloading your weapons is possible in game, it's wise to do it in the pause menu where you have access to your entire arsenal. Otherwise, you'll be at the mercy of the many monsters that stalk the island, but killing demonic fiends isn't the only thing you'll be doing, as there'll be puzzles to solve. Most of which will require you to find keys to unlock areas that weren't accessible before, or read through documents that will give hints on how to solve them. They also give backstory to the events that happened on the island, as well as flesh out the characters that Carnby and Aline will make contact with. On the surface, Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare ticks the correct boxes that make a survival horror game, but despite this in its favour, it has numerous problems.
Shit.
To begin with, some of the puzzles rely on reading through documents in order to get clues, which can be tiresome, and it does bring the pacing to a crawl, and it also doesn't help that some of the items don't have distinguishable clues to hint where you need to go, which can lead to a lot of backtracking in order to further progress through the game. Granted, you do have a map that can be accessed by pressing the L2 button, but even that becomes redundant since it doesn't tell you what room you're in, let alone where you need to go. If the developers made it more useful, then it would have alleviated the backtracking issue without compromising the game's pacing, and it would have made the puzzles less aggravating. I also don't think the game's scary due to how the combat functions. While the enemies can take multiple hits before their ultimate demise, there's an abundance of ammunition within your surroundings. This might seem the developers' attempt to balance the combat, but in actuality it removes any sense of dread which the game would enforce. After all, there's no point of unnerving the player if they're armed to the teeth and ready to fight. There are boss fights which you may encounter, but these moments are few and far between, and there's nothing dynamic about them that will make you switch tactics on the fly. The final boss in Carnby's storyline is terrible, as it's unclear what you need to do in order to defeat your opponent, and when you do figure it out, the solution is incredibly straightforward. Since the game was developed for multiple platforms, the footage you're watching is from the PlayStation version, and from my perspective I think they're okay, although the Dreamcast, PC and PS2 versions have improved texture detail. The animations for the most part are convincing both for the humanoid characters and the monsters. It's just too bad that Eileen's animations look awkward when moving, regardless whether she's wielding a weapon or not. The voice acting is serviceable, but there's nothing that will blow you away, and it doesn't help that both playable characters are rather bland. However, to the game's credit, the music and sound effects are excellent and enforce the spooky atmosphere. Finally, the pre-rendered backgrounds are varied enough to keep you playing towards the end, although the amount of detail can vary depending on which version of the game you're playing. Overall, Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare is a game that ticks the correct boxes that make a survival horror title, but it doesn't do enough to stand out from its competition as it borrows heavily from the early Resident Evil games. I don't like to use the term average when it comes to reviews because no matter the pros and cons that are brought up, the consumer at the end of the day is going to make a decision whether the product is worth the investment. Darkworks may have successfully brought the series back into the gaming scene at the time, but unfortunately the Alone in the Dark brand would go under different directions when it came to its gameplay mechanics, before ultimately meeting its crippling fate with last year's Alone in the Dark Illumination. The series may be dead and buried, but it attempted to keep up with gaming standards, and it was an IP that gave birth to a genre.